You are listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Hello everyone, welcome to the Architect Podcast, episode 14 for July 13th, 2015. I'm your host, Russell Allen Willems, and today I'm joined by guest Josh Harle, a multidisciplinary researcher and new media artist who has a background in computer science, philosophy, and sculpture. One of Josh's projects with pertinence to archaeology, although from his site not the only one, is a program called SiteViewer. That's an app that Josh built that allows archaeologists and other people out in the field or on mobile devices with not a lot of computer memory to display and share very high-resolution photogrammetric and 3D models of archaeological sites and artifacts. Welcome to the show, Josh.
Thank you, Russell. Cheers.
Hey, this is Chris. I just wanted to jump in for a minute. Russell had a few microphone issues with this episode. He was recording it on Google Hangouts, and I'm not sure if that was it, but we're fixing it. So sorry about that, and let's get back to it, and hopefully we'll have it fixed next time. Still some good information in this episode, though.
So, Josh, could you tell our listeners a little bit about some of your background and how you got involved in computer science, philosophy, and sculpture? Those seem, on the surface at least, to be three very different fields.
Yeah, it's a bit of a weird mix to come together. I'm pretty happy that they come together. So I started out originally, I guess before sort of formal studies, I had a very mixed set of interests. But for whatever reason, I chose to do computer science first. I studied at Reading University, and Reading at the time, it's still actually doing pretty well with it, had a very strong cybernetics, artificial intelligence, and sort of computer vision department. So as part of the computer science, I was doing a lot of things with early computer vision algorithms, which sort of led on in this sort of direction. But then, I finished the computer science degree, went into industry for a little bit. There were some fun projects to work on, but in general, I wasn't completely happy with sort of just sitting in an office, working away on some little bit of utilitarian code, and wanted to have a little bit more sort of broader education. So I came over to Australia. I'm half English, half Australian. My parents were emigrated over from Britain before I was born. I came over. This was my other possible sort of home place to see what it was like. I don't really like football very much, soccer. So I'm like, maybe rugby is the thing that I'm into. Not so much, unfortunately. So I don't fit completely into either of the two. But came over, did Bachelor of Arts, philosophy. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with that, but that was mind blowing. I mean, I guess
that wasn't the main goal.
When I went to, when I was, I think, I was into computers before I did the computer science degree. I was programming from a pretty early age. So the computer science degree, I wasn't very, apart from the sort of cybernetics and the computer vision stuff, I wasn't really learning very much. But the first semester of Bachelor of Arts, I learned more in that first semester about sociology, psychology, philosophy, et cetera, than I had in the whole computer science degree. So that was pretty exciting. And then went on to just expand it out a little bit more with the fine art. But I think they're very different, but it's really nice to bring them together. It's, sometimes it feels like being a bit of a jack of all trades, but it's sort of nice to bring ideas from one into the other, especially actually when it comes to sort of very contemporary uses of computer, like 3D reconstruction, 3D representation, where it's nice to have a bit of a critical view, coming from the philosophy and the anthropology and sociology sort of side of things. It's nice to be aware of some of the politics of the way of representing the world and capturing the world in that way. So, I'm pretty happy with being able to bring it together. And this is sort of one of those things where it's like trying to do a 3D reconstruction project, but also with a bit of a critical eye with the politics of archaeology in Australia, especially.
Yeah, that's something that I really like, kind of that combination you found of the different Venn diagrams, how they kind of overlap. in the center there when it comes to things like heritage that, has a material component, but also has a lot of philosophical component. There's that anthropology and archaeological theory of, well, how much do we really know about the past and how confident are we in our reconstructions, and the political and social aspect of those reconstructions have meaning for living people, especially as you mentioned here in the United States, there in Australia, and places around the world where there are living indigenous populations that we're looking at stuff that their ancestors built. And what we say about that as the degreed, employed professionals, hopefully employed professionals, has a lot of impact. It can be brought up in court as evidence, and has, sometimes to people's detriment, sometimes to people's benefit.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you mentioned that you studied kind of computers from an early age. Was that mostly on your own? Did you have that taught in classes in Britain and Australia?
Well, my dad comes from he was a contractor, and we were traveling around. He started out actually originally as a nuclear physicist, and then went into computers, because at that stage, that's sort of the entryway to computers was through these kind of exotic applied sort of sciences, and then it's like the only people who had access to these big sort of mainframe machines were people doing some very, very unorthodox sort of like really esoteric types of projects. So I was, making terrible games when I was like, absolutely, like variations on like guess what type of animal this is, and like variations on text-based maze games and things like that were just it was lucky that I was the only person that had to play them. but it got me sort of interested in programming and that sort of thing.
I'm right there with you. I remember my brother had a Atari 800, I think, that had the keyboard, and it had 2 Tide boxes, detergent boxes full of floppy disks that most of them were pirated games that he had gotten through the sneaker net or through friends. But there was that basic Atari cart that it would only work while the computer was running, because after that the RAM would get wiped. But you could sit there and program. You could sit there, 20 go to 10 over and over again and make little basic games.
Yeah, print I am cool. 20 go to 10. Absolutely, yeah.
That's great, though. So it sounds like, you came at it from a passionate view of, hey, I want to make this computer do something. I have access to this thing maybe not a lot of people do. And you kind of learn to bend it to your will slowly, and now you've gone on and gotten some of the education and theory behind it, and you're still doing that. You're making the computer work for you rather than the other way around.
It's fun to be able to sort of be on the side of building, you're not just sort of, it's very easy if you're working on a set of tools from a purely computer vision is like really pretty intensive maths and optimizing algorithms and things like that. And if you're sort of on that part, you kind of are so focused on solving those problems that you're not really in a position to sort of get out there and use the tools that you've made apart from in collaboration with other people. But it's kind of nice from where I am. Like I'm not a super advanced programmer or anything. Like I'm just I suppose I take bunches of tools and bring them together is the main thing that I would say that I do. So I have something that I want to do, and I'm, they say a lazy programmer is a good programmer. So I go, I'm trying to accomplish this thing, and I'm too lazy to try and do it myself. And I know that if I spend a little bit of time sort of putting the things together, then other people will be able to be as lazy as I am in the future, which is sort of that.
That's great. I'll probably... No, go ahead. I guess I was going to say, I was going to ask at maybe a later point now, because you raised an interesting point about maybe defining computer vision for some of our listeners. I think I know what it is, but I'm sure there's more in depth. But while we can, maybe talk more about that, you aren't the ace PhD computer scientist programmer that, is programming a low-level assembly and can completely make the computer do everything they want. But it sounds like you used, as the lazy programmer or the smart programmer, you've found ways, maybe open source packages or third parties, stuff that's already been built, that you can kind of customize and build up into something that you can use without having to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah, it's a low-hanging fruit. And it's a shame that there's not more sort of, I guess the jack of all trades are pretty useful for multidisciplinary or cross-disciplinary research, because if you don't have any, if you're not, au fait with some of these approaches to doing things, there you might have a problem and you have no idea of whether it would take like 500 hours or like whether someone could bang out something in 5 minutes to accomplish it. So it's nice to have that sort of perspective to be able to see, well, this is actually something that will be very easy to speed up. You're doing something like I was working with some what do they call themselves? Perceptual neurobiology researchers at UNSW. Okay. And they were doing a process that was like, they had a huge amount of expertise in a really particular processing methodology, which is like basically taking fMRI brain scans. So like you have this animated model of what's going on in the brain over a certain amount of time, and then you do what's called a principal component analysis, which is taking this like problem and trying to go, all right, how can we reduce, this is many dimensions of this problem, which is basically like all of the neurons are the dimensions of your problem. And you go, oh, well, how can we try and look at this problem and reduce it down so we can explain it in the least number of dimensions as possible?
What are the things that have the most impact on that you can get close enough if you recreate just those main factors, the primary components, like you were saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess the analogy that I normally use is if you have like a motion in 3D space that's doing something, and then you go and it's like, along 3 axes, it's sort of like doing a weird swirly sort of down the drain, the plug hole sort of thing. Just looking at the data, the data isn't very simple, but you can probably describe that. Okay, here's this plane across these dimensions, and here's this sort of motion, and then like you can pretty much sum it up in a very simple way if you have enough time to sort of think
algorithm that says, yeah, we can get pretty close, a best fit for that.
Yeah. So they were doing that on a single computer overnight, on their single desktop computer overnight. And they could do like one data set, and if the data set didn't work, then when they got there in the morning, they'd have to maybe do it on the weekend if they needed to do more data than a single night's worth. And that was like such a point where, if you have a little bit of expertise, then you can throw that out into what I did basically was something to put it into the cloud, so they could do like thousands in one go. But it doesn't take very long to do that. It's like, it's a little bit of investment in time for building that tool set, and then it's just the return is so much bigger than the amount of time it takes to work on it. So I suppose for me that thing of being able to have the perspective of seeing, and sometimes actually is the computer science part, that's sort of like obsessive, let me trying to make a tool for that bit, is completely not pragmatic at all. And you spend longer making a tool to do this little task than it would ever take you to just try and do the task. But at least there's that idea that if you put it out into the world, then other people will be able to benefit from it as well, which is nice. It's nice feeling like, the time that you're doing is kind of is contributing to other people's projects as well as your own, which is a nice feeling.
You're kind of paying it forward because you found open source projects that have, saved your bacon in the past or made a really complex problem much, much simpler because they said, just, hey, you don't have to work out how to do this. You just put the data in on one side, it comes out the other side the way you want it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I know probably in the show notes I don't know if you ever read the webcomic XKCD, but there's one very much like that. That's a graph of, when is it worth it to make that tool? And it's like, if you're going to do it 2 or 3 times, it's probably not worth it. But if you're doing it 4 or 5 times, then the cost pays off exponentially.
Yeah. Although, I mean, like some part of that, it feels strange as well to be between these 3 different disciplines, like the computer science, philosophy, or it's actually like post-structuralist philosophy is a sort of thing. So it's kind of, sociology, philosophy, all these things that are together, and then the art. And they kind of, sometimes I describe it as having like a little seesaw in the three-pronged seesaw in my head. So like when one particular way of thinking sort of like pulls you over to another. And if I spend too long programming, then I just become a very, very weird person, unfortunately. But that mentality is like, well, actually, you can spend a long time making a tool, but part of that, it's kind of like, well, you could go and You could watch TV, you could watch a film or something. It's kind of an entertaining thing to do, to just sort of like problems. Or you could play Sudoku or something, or you could make a tool that does it and get a little bit of enjoyment out of that process as well.
Right. If you're doing it right, it becomes sort of meditative and a little thing to zen out on. For me, I find as long as I stop at the right point, as long as I stop at the point where everything's working, and don't past that, right before bed or right before time to go eat lunch, because if I do, everything breaks, and then I'm just pissy the rest of the night, the rest of the day, tossing and turning, thinking about, my code doesn't work.
Yeah. I suppose the analogy is if you do your Sudoku and then you get to the last number and it doesn't add up, and you're like, this is not a satisfying experience at all.
This is more than a problem than it was a solution.
Yeah.
All right. Well, right now I'd like to take a quick minute to thank one of our best sponsors, The Art of Charm and the Art of Charm podcast. Art of Charm is a great website and resources that will teach you how to leverage the power of social dynamics and applied psychology to win friends at home, persuade people at work, earn the respect of your peers and colleagues, create and deepen personal relationships, and master the art of networking. You can read more about these and many more topics, including getting some free resources and ebooks at theartofcharm.com. So, Josh, real quickly, if you could, I know it can be a complex topic, but computer vision, can you explain that to some of our listeners about what that is and what all entails, and maybe what your interest is in that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for this particular project, so computer vision is like very, very broad, just sort of trying to get a computational understanding of what's out in the world. So that could be, very basic motion detection will be using a webcam. So it looks at image after image as time goes on, and very, very basic motion detection will just be going like, what's the difference between this frame and the next frame? And then if there's enough difference between it, then it will like highlight that area of the frame and say something is moving in that area. So that's one bit of like computer vision.
Okay.
The stuff that we're using for this 3D reconstruction is a really nice. It's called photogrammetry. Is the general term for sort of measuring and reconstructing from images, and they've been doing that for a very long time. They've been doing that with sort of reconnaissance images over war zones and things like that for a good long time. But this particular method that I'm using for building 3D models, which is one that's being used a fair amount, a lot of people in archaeology and geology are using this method. Because it produces like really great sort of photorealistic, very easy to implement 3D reconstructions from photos. It takes a lot of photos, but when you've got enough sort of overlap, you can get, you basically run around a site, take enough photos, and you get a nice 3D model out of it. And one thing that's really nice, especially from the archaeological and geological sort of areas, people don't necessarily realize this if that's your only exposure to these tool sets. But it works fantastically for rocks. It's like it's amazing. And then like people, if you ever try and do it on like a building or something with like reflective surfaces or areas of uniform color or something, then it will probably completely die. But if your only experience is working with rocks, with things that are non-reflective, with a lot of sort of natural texture, then you're going to think this stuff is magic, basically, because it works so well on those data sets.
That's so amazing. The technology, I know a couple of our guests have talked about PhotoScan, Agisoft PhotoScan.
PhotoScan is good. Absolutely.
I've been really excited to people on the gaming side. I know there's one game, The Vanishing of Ethan Carter, that they did primarily almost all their environments using photogrammetry, and we're able to have a small team create a large number of 3D models, very realistic ones, by using some of the same techniques that you're describing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and that's kind of the sort of focus of this project. This project came out of a residency with the University of Western Australia. One part was the IVEC, the Advanced Visualization Lab, and the other part was the Center for Rock Art Research and Management. I was coming to Western Australia with this sort of, a bit of experience using things like Agisoft or in their precursors or parallel projects that work slightly different. Agisoft is fantastic because it just takes all of you don't have to think about any of the parameters. You just sort of hit the button, and generally it's quite good parameters. Yeah. But so they have these big 3D reconstructions, but they're using it because they're like 5 million, 6 million. Actually, the model that I might have a chance to show you, I thought it was a 5 million poly model. It's actually a 9 million poly model. So It's absolutely enormous. And if you have that size of reconstruction, there's only a couple of options for them for visualizing it. Either they bring people into their advanced visualization lab and run it on these amazing machines.
Right.
And that's another thing as well. There's a nice partnership between the Center for Rock Art Research and Management and the Advanced Visualization Lab. So a lot of the archaeologists are coming in and using the machines in the Advanced Visualization Lab, but they don't have any idea of quite how amazingly powerful these machines are. So it's like, it's absolutely like smooth as anything reconstructions of these like 9 million poly models. So if you bring people to your lab and show them, then it looks great. The other alternative is getting people to like pre-render the video.
Okay.
So you can show it, put it online or show it off at a conference or something.
The equivalent of someone holding a camcorder while in this environment, or the computer equivalent of that, a fly-through or a flyby.
Yeah, exactly. Or, like a lot of them were just sort of there to illustrate the 3D element. So it was just like a pan across or maybe like a slight shift of the thing. Yeah, along the lines of that. So like completely baked into the video, the motion is completely baked in. You can't go anywhere else.
It's not interactive.
So my sort of contribution to that, talking about computer games and computer games using photogrammetry, was to look at again, like I don't have a computer game development background at all, other than having played a bunch of computer games and just, I have some art games that I've been working on. But look at YouTube, do a little bit of research. And what I did was take the techniques that you would use if you were designing a level in a computer game and applied those techniques to optimizing the mesh to these like absolutely enormous 3D reconstructions. So basically the tool sets that I've got that go along with SiteViewer are a set of tools that do the same thing that you would do if you were designing a computer game. So, the environments in a computer game look absolutely breathtaking, but underneath all of that is an enormous amount of experience and craft in how to optimize those to look great, but to have less polygons, basically. And that doesn't necessarily
be used, and using things like almost like a movie set, treating it as if we don't have to show it, if we don't have to render it, if nobody's going to be able to touch it or go there, we don't. Those type of techniques.
Yeah, that's true. Well, unless it doesn't have to be as sort of theatrical to that, because the one thing that I've been repeating a bunch in Western Australia was the idea that modern graphics hardware and computers is developed along with games developers. So they'll send their prototype card to the games developers. They'll be working on their new game, trying to push the envelope as much as possible. And
they're aiming for hardware that isn't commercially available until next year or 2 years or when the game launches.
Yeah, absolutely. So they'll be working to this sort of like hardware level that's not in the wild yet, but they have constant conversations between the hardware developers and the game developers about what techniques to use to get the most out of that hardware. So one thing that comes up when you're looking at these giant models is that if you just hit the button on Agisoft, it will make this model that's like a huge number of polygons, and all of the detail in that model is represented in polygons. Whereas in a computer game, what you have is a mesh, which is a lot much more simple, but then the detail is still there. It's just the way that the detail is represented is in a very, very different way. So rather than having the detail actually sort of like in the raw polygons of the model, what you do is smooth out the model, so it's much more simple, and then project like a bump map and a normal map over the top of it. Bump map just sort of after the fact applies changes in height to the surface, and the normal map applies the effects of the direction of that surface. So like if light is coming from one side, the normal map will say this part of the surface will be in shadow and this part of the surface will be in the broad bit of the light. So actually it doesn't have to be sneaky in the way that it produces that effect. You can still have it look exactly the same. All that detail can still perceptually be there.
So it's a little bit similar to like in geographic information software, where you might have a raster that is every single bit recorded across the surface, or you might have a vector which simplifies some of that, but you can end up getting the same result by interpolating between. Maybe you don't record everything between, but you say this elevation over here is this elevation over here. We have a line between them. Here's that grade between them.
Yeah, some of that is there.
But again, you talk about bump mapping and normal mapping?
Yeah. Normal mapping and bump mapping. Some of it is interpolation, and one thing that you can do that you can't do with the raw geometry is just conventional like image compression stuff. So if you pull all of your detail out of your polygons, put it into an image, and then you can compress that image, then you can have the same effect compressing that detail. I mean, it pulls it into a very different problem area, basically. If you take it from the raw polygons and put it into an image, those different maps, as they're called. And one thing that is really great about that is like modern graphics engines, graphics cards are designed to process those maps in parallel. So they'll do like maybe 1,000 polygons, 1,000 pixels of that image in one go, in this like on their like as part of their parallel process.
So if you split those out into different threads, as opposed to saying it's all polygons, process it all as polygons, the processor on the graphics card says, okay, I can handle that. I've got a defined pathway for polygons, bump mapping, normal mapping, and do them all at once. Cool.
And also, it's not, it doesn't have to be, it's doing floating point. Sorry to get like super, I don't know if this is super technical.
A little bit over my head, but there's people out there that are totally interested, and I absolutely am.
Yeah, right. So it's doing a different type of processing as well. Super parallel processing of the maps, and it's doing it as a floating point thing. So it's not, the thing about graphics cards is they absolutely screen through these processes, and they do an awful lot of them at the same time. But there's no requirement for them to have exactly the same result for each pixel every time that it runs. So that's one of the ways that the graphics cards can be much, much faster than a conventional CPU, is that they know that it's not a critical process. So, if the color of your pixel is like is out by one value, like 1 out of 255 of each color or something, slightly out for one frame of that image, it's not going to be the end of the world. So they can just blast through that sort of stuff. And another good thing about that is like all these modern mobile devices, because they know people are going to want to sort of play around with 3D content, they've got their own accelerated 3D pipeline in them. So they all do it slightly differently, but that's why you can put this content onto an iPad or a mobile phone or whatever and have it run nice and smoothly, because they're thinking about the same thing as with a desktop PC, for example. They're thinking about people using 3D content.
So this is a great example of what you were talking about earlier, of rather than trying to reinvent the wheel for sharing geographic spaces, archaeology or whatever, you took a look and said, hey, what's similar to this? Well, games, 3D games, are sharing environments that are mostly fictional, but nowadays more and more real. Games like Assassin's Creed are recreating Jerusalem and Venice and Rome and all these other cities to a pretty high level of fidelity. And although they've been gamified a little bit in terms of trying to find a critical path or putting game elements in there, Some of the architectural recreations are amazing, and something that I always kind of wished, instead of playing the game, sometimes you could just turn all that off and walk around.
Yeah.
But what you found is that, graphics hardware kind of evolved to meet that as they grew up in parallel. And now you've got a way to use that for, what some people might term serious games or just 3D visualizations of archaeological sites. That's really cool.
Yeah, it's, to see people, from their perspective, the UWA people, they didn't have to do it at all. It's just that they could have probably continued quite happily to build these enormous. Yeah, exactly. It's just like for me, I didn't have the luxury of having any kind of equipment. So if I wanted to run, I have to sort of be a bit clever about it.
Right.
And that's definitely It's just what do you do from a very different sort of. From a very different domain, the computer game domain, but you're trying to do the same thing effectively. You're trying to build a compelling 3D environment with as much detail as possible that will run as fast as possible. And actually, there's the idea that you have to lose detail when you're doing it, that it has to be sort of like crafty and reusing certain assets and things like that, isn't true at all. You can get the same perceptual detail in there. Without losing anything, and it's much faster. Yeah,
that's great. Well, we've talked about this quite a bit, and I do want to talk some more, like you said, about some of the philosophy of how these things are represented. And then for some of the more technical side, what I like to do is leave our listeners with maybe some tools they can check out about if they're interested in getting into this. SiteViewer is obviously one tool they can use, but if they want to get into, say, using some of the game engines or other techniques that you've used, we can talk about that in a minute.
That would be great.
Could you go ahead and show us SiteViewer? Do you have that ability to show us on the screen?
Yeah, let's do it. Let me start it up. I've been talking about it for quite a while, so it's probably best that I actually do. Let's go. All right.
And I'll go ahead and check to see. We're actually recording this podcast live, and I sent out a couple advertisements. We'll see if anybody's actually on there and talking about. I'll open up the Q&A for just a minute. And
brilliant.
Not have it at all.
I'm just going to, so here's SiteViewer. I just, I don't know if that was shared for everyone to see a moment ago.
Yes, it's up and we are able to look at it.
Okay, this is the terrible user interface, unfortunately. It's more of a
you're not a designer. Well, I guess you are new.
Yeah. I think, most of the effort went into other bits. This is like completely utilitarian, this bit. But I will just open up a reconstruction that I've got already. And one nice thing about this, it will download content from the internet and cache it. So the next time that you try and connect to it, it will just load from locally from the device.
Oh, perfect.
So you can load this stuff onto like a tablet PC. As long as you've got an internet connection when you're downloading it the first time through, then you're fine. And then once you've done it, that first download process, you can take it wherever you want. Basically, it can go anywhere. So this is
and it probably knows when to update whenever changes have been made to the model or there's a new version on the server.
Yeah, you can update things through that. And also, I sort of, from this residency, I was going through sort of building all these tools, and then very late in the game, I realized that if people didn't have, an Apple development license or anything, then they weren't going to be able to actually easily share these. So the SiteViewer was kind of the coup of the project to realize that it would be also a very useful tool to have people being able to share their own arbitrary content. And they can share their arbitrary content without sharing it with the world at the moment because it's just a web address. So if you want to share something privately between two people, you can they can download the app and then just share it however you want. So I think it's quite powerful being able to allow people to just like put whatever they want in this format up there. And yeah, there's no barrier to having to spend time waiting for it to get approved on the app store or anything like that. Right. You can just hang it out and see it. So at the heart of the process is just taking a giant model, splitting it up into sections, and then doing this optimization process on it. So each bit of this geometry is the low poly proxy, so it's reduced down the number of polygons and then reprojects over these the texture map that makes it look like the right colors and everything.
So if we look at just the
map,
wireframe, this might look completely different and not as nicely detailed. But with the bump mapping and the normal mapping on there, we're seeing what looks very much like the real site itself.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it splits the problem up into sort of two different areas, and then the mesh, the wireframe of this would be like it would look pretty simple. It's like an 80,000 poly wireframe for this.
Down from, you said 9 million, the original model?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, that's quite the order of magnitude difference.
Yeah, it's not too bad. I mean, like, one sort of thing I should say about this reconstruction is it's produced by about, I think, 10, maybe 15 photos from this angle that I'm standing at the moment. Okay. So you see that when I go around the back, there's a big black hole. It just couldn't see it at the time. And I'm quite impressed with... it managed to be a very good reconstruction from just like a very few set of cameras. In the past, I've done photo shoots of sites that have been like 1,200 images or 2,000 images to get the detail, but this one didn't really need it.
And what are we looking at here? What type of archaeological site for some of our viewers?
Well, so this is this is the Bart Peninsula in Pilbara in Western Australia.
Okay.
And this one actually doesn't have, like, very close to this, there are petroglyphs that we can look at. In this one, there aren't actually any petroglyphs. It's just more of a reconstruction of the sort of geographical features of this site.
Kind of, it looks like if I were out there, this would look like a good test to see, a lot of angles, a lot of different colors. If I were going to try to test this software, it'd be a good chance to see how well it handled really irregular geometry, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I mean, there's the Bart Peninsula, because of the type of rocks there, is very is more challenging than other alternatives, than sort of just like cave-based rock art, I'd say, because there's so many overhangs and occlusions and things like that. This has worked out quite well, I'd say, apart from the fact that I didn't walk to this bit to take the pictures from this angle.
On the back.
Yeah, but it's generally looks like a big slope of scree, giant chunks of rocks, and that's kind of difficult from the photogrammetry perspective, because you need to have 3 overlapping images of any feature point that you want to get. So if there's sort of like a dark, shadowy, it gets more difficult to deal with that. So this is sort of a test of these features, and it's come out quite well. I can try and load another one, although I think, it will take a while to download, although maybe that would be good to show off the downloading process.
Yeah, so is it converting on the fly, or whenever you upload this into SiteViewer, you've already done the processing to get it down to a much smaller, low poly version?
Yeah, that's right. So at the moment, it's not converting on the fly. If you want to take your data set, your 3D model, and put it into a format that can be downloaded by SiteViewer, there's a tutorial, set of tutorials actually for like exactly what you want to do. The nice thing about that, though, is that that process that's talked about in the tutorial, it doesn't just apply to SiteViewer. It's sort of a nice thing to do anyway to optimize your model. So you go through this process. Tool sets that I've got are a script for. So the tools are actually on the Tactical Space website.
And I'm pulling that up for our viewers right now. Your profile page, and then the Tactical Space Lab. And I love that you already have, as opposed to so many other archaeology software projects, you actually have tutorials and other kind of resources available for people. For instance, getting photo scan models on iPad. You have a 4-part video on YouTube, and it running on an Android phone. Just having that level of documentation, especially as videos, makes things a lot easier. For myself, at least, for someone that's trying to reuse a program.
Yeah, well, even for me, if I'm coming back to a project that I haven't looked at for a while, it's kind of nice to be able to watch my own tutorial videos for it to remember how exactly it's done.
Right, that's the thing. You're writing comments to yourself 6 months later as much as to anybody else.
Yeah, exactly. And I was so this video that you're showing at the moment, I was quite impressed that it runs on a mobile phone. I wasn't anticipating it being able to run on a mobile phone, but it's pretty nice to be able to go from something that takes a $30,000 computer to being able to run on a mobile phone.
Yeah, to me that's approaching magic, where the device in your pocket, with the right cloud backend and processing. And this is great that it's loading up kind of the environment now, and we see the on-screen controls that I'm assuming you can kind of manipulate these a little bit, unlike the videos, the static videos you were talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it's modeled pretty much on a first-person shooter navigation control. One element of this form of visualization, and also feeding into that idea of being informed by the process of building computer game levels, is that I'm really interested, I guess, more from the art sort of perspective, at these reconstructions, not just being sort of like objects that you look at, but things where you can get more of a sense of the space or the location that you're in. So the idea that rather than just doing these sort of untethered fly-throughs of space, that you're actually walking through and sort of moving in that sort of first-person shooter perspective, where your perspective is at eye height. You're having to sort of climb over things. So if I don't
have that God's eye view that looking at down from an aerial image or a map, gives you kind of a false impression of what could be seen from different places.
Yeah, exactly. So that's
really neat.
I'm just climbing on top of my bit of geometry. And if you get to a wall, you get stuck. It's like, if you can't climb over it, then that's where you're going to stay.
And Josh, it may not be showing us your live feed right now. I'm still looking at a static view of the site.
Oh, okay, that's fine. Let me see. Did you see it at all? I might stop it and start it again.
The screen share, and then you might have to pick a different window, especially if it's full screen. I know we're using Google Hangouts, which is great, but does have some hiccups here and there.
Okay, let's try that. How about now?
Black screen, but let's give it a second. Yes, I can see you moving around now.
I'll move around very slowly to give it time to catch up. I just sort of showing off very much the model for how you move around these 3D reconstructions is based on a first-person shooter, and the perspective is a little sort of modeled player character who can sort of climb over things as well, so you can move around the space, and if you hit a wall that you can't climb over, then you're stuck there. Otherwise, you can sort of walk around on the top of things. Yeah.
So this is actually applying these as if they were solid surfaces and giving them some physicality to them, rather than just as an image or a digital wireframe that you can just walk right through or zoom right through if you're not too careful. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, it's much closer to a computer game environment than just a visualization. And I suppose one thing that would be nice to, I was looking at taking ambient sound recordings from the sites and things like that, and putting them into the environments. And for another project that I haven't implemented on SiteViewer yet, I have a process of reconstructing people's motion. If they're walking through a site and sort of as a guide, giving a tour of the site or just sort of talking about the site, then another thing that came out of this residency that actually you can see if I restart this, you can see in the start image for it.
So you can kind of add, I know some games, there's an option in first-person shooters and other first-person adventure games to turn on and off like a head bob that kind of adds a little bit of motion as if you're taking steps, or the ability to jump or climb. You mean things like that?
Yeah, well, what this is in terms of reconstructing the motion, this is if you record someone giving a space, then you can play back that person moving through the space, and you can sort of follow them. You can either see through their eyes, it's quite a nice thing, or you can just follow them as a little sort of avatar through the space. So what this diagram, what this sort of intro screen shows, that blue line sort of snaking along the bottom of that site is motion that's been reconstructed from a GoPro that someone has been wearing. So you strap a GoPro to someone's head, they walk through, they give their tour, they point at things, move through the space, and then you can take the audio and the reconstructed motion of that tour and put it back into the reconstructed environment and play back their motion through the space. So
not only could you give you're literally seeing through someone else's eyes if you're using this, or if you're using like a camera-enabled Google Glass or Oculus, but you could, essentially have someone give a group of kids a tour, school children a tour, or like colleagues, someone on site walks through, maybe records their narration or does a condition assessment, thinking for cultural resource management, and then packages it up, sends it off to their colleagues and says, hey, I know you're doing the write-up. Here's my walkthrough as I'm chatting about, look, here's a little bit of damage here. We've seen some heavy rains. Maybe this has damaged, the United States of Pueblo site or some other thing. That's very interesting.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I like to actually, talking of Rift, it's right on the edge of implementing the Rift for a SiteViewer, because I'm building it in Unity 3D. It's very easy just to throw in the Oculus Rift cam into Unity 3D. So
I've seen some of your experiments on your Google Plus page, and that was going to be my next question, because that's something I've been working on too from the Google Cardboard end, because I can't afford an Oculus.
The Cardboard's good.
Unity. Yeah, it's good enough for some purposes, but not quite there for others.
I mean, it's certainly nice to be able to share it, for sure. But this is another thing where it's like such a small little bit of effort to implement that. And then you go from being able to share your arbitrary 3D models to being able to share them with anyone, anywhere with a Oculus Rift. It's a very small amount of effort. And I'm looking forward to implementing it. I think it's going to be the next couple of days, actually, that I'm going to be doing that.
Okay, please upload a video, when you're comfortable, but I'd love to see that, especially if you can strap someone's grandmother into it. And get a reaction.
And thought of that. Yeah, someone who will react very well. All right, I'll do that. Yeah.
I'll take a quick break here and just thank kind of our host podcast network, the Archaeology Podcast Network, and let people know that you can find not only the Archaeotech podcast, but several other shows on archaeology, including some great new shows, such as the CRM Archaeology Podcast, which has been around for a while, then an Archaeology's podcast, Struggling Archaeologist's Guide to Getting Dirty by Jenny McNiven, Profiles in CRM, which details different people working in CRM currently and how their experience being an archaeologist has been. And especially interesting, so a wider audience, is Excavating Sex with Sarah Head and Ashley Morton. You can find these and other shows on archaeologypodcastnetwork.com or on iTunes or Stitcher Radio.
Great. I have a demo actually from a slightly different project that was a precursor to this rock art stuff, that will give an idea of what I'm in from the tours a little bit more.
That'd be great.
If you are happy to have me do it, let me see if I can.
Absolutely. Matter of fact, while you're doing that, I'll set up. Do you mind if I show off your GitHub portfolio? And
no, not at all. It's very diverse. It's a bit eclectic, my GitHub portfolio. But yeah, by all means.
Well, I'd love to hear just kind of, as someone that has an interest in archaeology, but is not necessarily an archaeologist themselves, all the different things that you're working on. I think that's something myself and other archaeologists can learn, is that there's people out there that have the skills and have the interest, and maybe just, archaeology is one place where they can apply those. So for some of our listeners that may not be familiar, GitHub is kind of the Facebook of social code sharing. and it's a way to track different versions of your software using a version-controlled software just called Git that's free to use. And here you can see Joshua Harle's profile at Neonascent. And he's got SiteViewer, Nugget Master, 3D sound tracking, all sorts of really cool things, including one on board game design. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, like the stuff right at the top is very funny. There's more sort of useful bits and pieces and tools and sort of forks of tool, like slight modifications of other tools to do things. The Nugget Master is actually Arduino programming for making a robot arm eat a chicken McNugget. So, in terms of the diversity of things on the GitHub, it's pretty funny.
So while I show off kind of the Android market and iTunes market story pages, you got to tell me how the story about the chicken McNugget eating robot. How did that come about?
I'm a new media artist as well as just sort of a general researcher, and I developed that sort of as a project for trying to make a robot do the most sort of weird and unlikely thing that I could think of, and that was it. So it's quite an involved process, and actually part of the digestive process of this nugget eating the chicken McNugget, of the robot eating the chicken nugget, is an automated food processor stage that's kind of explosive in its digestive vigor, let's say. So it's pretty fun to watch.
Okay. Do you have a YouTube video of that process?
There is. Right? Yeah, there's definitely.
That's a subscription.
I think. Yeah. Let me find. Here we go. All right. So this is a tunnel reconstruction that I did. This is the one that was. There's 1,200 images. It's a 35-meter long tunnel, just not far from where I live. And this was sort of before I got the access to go to Western Australia and visit some of these remote sites. This is pretty much my proxy for that, because it's, other than rock art, graffiti in terms of computer vision is a very similar subject. It's non-reflective generally. It's got a lot of very computer vision interesting features that allow it to 3D reconstruct really well. And I was thinking that this sort of thing was the closest thing to kind of a cave reconstruction that I could do just 5 minutes from where I live. So it was, this is another sort of being lazy. But one thing that's built in, so the detail's pretty good for this. And I was also sort of trying to push the envelope in terms of what detail I could get, and exploring this process of optimizing the meshes and being able to get it to run pretty smoothly. But another thing that I experimented with from here is tours.
Oh, neat.
So this is another case of a terrible user interface design decision. The avatar that's running through doing the tours is very weird. It's sort of my idea of a kind of a neutral thing. But
but this is actually the model acting as a tour guide for the viewer?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, wow.
So I'm going to have to turn it off because he's talking quite loudly in my ears. I'm not sure if anyone else can hear it. But he's got a little torch attached to his hand. So when he points at things, it lights up the thing that he's pointing at, and sort of he can run around and point at things and give a sort of bit of an annotated or guided tour of the site.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's something I've noticed, again, going back to computer games, especially ones that done by the publisher Valve and developer Valve.
Yeah.
Including commentary as little nodes or audio pieces that as you're walking around in the environment, you get some context or a bit of story or a bit of how it was made. But here, obviously, you could get all sorts of things like interpretations by this archaeologist or by this indigenous person or by, in this case, an artist, a tagger that was there or has some of their stuff in there, maybe talks a little bit about the culture of tagging and why they're out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's all, the focus is all sort of trying to push the incredibly powerful, 3D reconstruction technology, trying to push it back into something where it's not just the site as an object. It's something where you start to feel a sense of what it's like, basically, a sense of it as a location that you can inhabit in one form or another. Especially, as a digital heritage or digital conservation sort of project, some of these places might not be around in their. The tunnel itself, it's probably less catastrophic that it doesn't exist in its form at the moment. But they whitewashed it 2 weeks after I did this set of photography, and I had no idea. It's about 7 or 8 years of graffiti on it.
Yeah.
2 weeks after they whitewashed it, so it was a little bit sort of bittersweet. It was great that I was there.
I remember being in college and walking by this kind of highway. There's a little park next to it that had these soundproof walls, but there was kind of a war going on, or at least a dialogue between the police and the taggers that, I think I got whitewashed once, and the next week when I walked my dog past it, it just exploded. There was tons of art everywhere on it, really beautiful pieces in some cases. And then the next week it had been painted over again. It was all and it went back and forth for at least a week or two. That there was that was both sides. But you're right. This is the case with a lot of antiquities that have been stolen or lost, or as in the case of Syria and other places, just massive looting, or ISIL or other groups actually going in and intentionally destroying those places of cultural heritage.
Absolutely.
That sometimes that's all you have left is the photographs or the digital recording.
Yeah, it's a bit scary, for sure. And it's, this is potentially some of the politics of this process as well, is that there's, in Western Australia, there's a lot of mining going on. Some of these sites are still very fragile and actually are the Barrett Peninsula, for example. There's a major mining corporation is operating within the Barrett Peninsula, and these sites are under threat, a very, very, very real threat to their continuation. So I guess I'm feeling that it's important to make them. I'm very ambivalent towards the term capture, because I think the term capture has a lot of. Yeah, but at least sort of trying to evoke the sense of these sites as they are to be within them. Rather than just here is here is a bit of rock art as an object that we're going to look at and sort of analyze, rather than here is a site that we can sort of go in and get some sort of a feel of being within. And that again is just coming from playing a lot of computer games, seeing how a lot of mapping and scanning technology. Its job is to make things more legible, and pull the information out. Things like Google Maps, where you have a very, very abstract representation of the world according to certain design decisions. Within my research, I was looking at that in comparison to computer games, where you have these incredibly believable, emotionally compelling, these sites that really make you feel like they're real and really make you feel like you're inhabiting them. But they're fictional spaces. They're entirely fictional spaces. It's interesting for me to look at the contrast between representations of real spaces, which are completely abstract from the sense of being there, and then 3D reconstructed spaces in computer games, which are entirely fictional, but actually really believable spaces inhabited by pretty believable characters.
Great.
And you actually get a really strong sense of the atmosphere in them.
Well, I like that you took that lesson from kind of computer games of, you were talking earlier about wanting to include the soundscape of what it sounds like at that place. Is it quiet? Is there traffic nearby? We've spoken earlier on our podcast with Stu Eve, who's with Heritage Management in the UK, and he wants to do, even smells of, if you walk up to a hearth site and that would have been a cooking fire prehistorically, smell some roasting meat. There's these contexts of things that we don't think about. Was it a smelly area? Is this we dig a lot of latrines in archaeology. It doesn't smell too great. Maybe that's when you want to flick that button off. But thinking about them in the larger context, that, if we're doing our jobs right, that's always what we're trying to think about is, landscapes as opposed to necessarily sites, or how this can be viewed, or, is this someplace you want to be at midday, in June or July, or in Australia, I guess, in December or January, or is it going to be too hot? What types of things make sense and capture might not capture, but document as much of that as you can for that reconstruction. That's never going to be getting to the post-structural. It's never going to be perfectly communicated, but you can approach it. It's an asymptotic thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Well, we only have a few minutes left, Josh. One follow-up question that I'll ask you, and then I'll leave it open to you if you have any other projects you'd like to talk about or any things that you'd like to have people know. You mentioned real places in games, or that places that you felt a really emotional connection to. Can you maybe for our listeners just list some of those examples of when you think about doing archaeology reconstructions or reconstructing environments, you're like, never actually been there, this place doesn't exist, but man, I've got memories of hiking up, this slope, or, battling things in this valley?
Yeah, I can actually. There's a set of conferences in Paris in October. One of them is the National Forum for Experimental Art, or actually National Experimental Art Forum, I think it is, where I'm doing a safari of these digital spaces. So cool. The workshop is called Inhabiting Digital Spaces, and I'm just going through. The IVEC lab has got this fantastic wall-sized, 6K by 6K 3D screen. So the idea is to stand people in front of that and just load up these locations and do a little bit of a safari through these spaces and go this is why it works, this is why it's compelling, this is what's going on. So I would say one obvious location is in a game called Dear Esther, which is sort of a non-linear storytelling game that's based on a Hebridean island. It's absolutely breathtaking, just incredibly beautiful. Incredibly beautiful. Yeah. GTA is really good, looking at a very different way of representing space. So I suppose I look at three different ways at representing space, or sort of evoking locations. One of them is these post-apocalyptic environments where it's actually what you're doing is very much sort of archaeology. You're walking through these destroyed post-apocalyptic environments and trying to piece together the moment before the fall and the lives that were there before. So
they're pretty heavy-handed in that. That's interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So some of it is you can just see from what's happened to the landscape, and then they do tend to do quite a heavy-handed storytelling thing where you very conveniently find people's diaries and things like that just amongst everything, and
just in case it wasn't clear.
That. Yeah, exactly. But that's that's a very haunting sort of experience where you're going through and you're sort of just you're piecing it together yourself. It's you're kind of creating your own ghosts in that environment, because it's there's no actual inhabitants in it, and it's convenient for the game developers as well, because it's very difficult to do compelling artificial intelligence characters. It's really difficult to have people there and talk to them and for it to feel like a really convincing engagement. But if you just leave the people out and put the signs of them having been there, then you do it all in you create it yourself.
Those gaps.
Yeah, exactly. And it's it works really well, absolutely. And then, of course, there's things like GTA where they're creating the sense of a city, I think it's GTA 4, where it's in this sort of caricature of New York. And if you've been to parts of New York, there's districts that have been sort of reduced down to a single block, but you can tell where they are, right? They
have that flavor of, well, this is Chinatown, or this is the Bronx,
yeah.
Some colors and artistical things, the sounds that you hear. I just wish GTA didn't, I guess what's the term, take the piss so much. It's such a great job, and they're approaching such a high level of fidelity that there's a bigger disconnect between how beautiful things are and then the dick and poop jokes on the other end.
Yeah, right.
For me at least.
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of craft and art in it, and then it's sort of a whole load of things that kind of get in. But I mean, you were saying before,
part of the joke.
Yeah, potentially. They don't take them. Yeah. You were saying before about being in these environments and just wanting to not play the storyline and just walking around. But I mean, that's something that I do quite a lot. Just spending a long time just looking at the environments and sort of getting a feel for the location rather than sort of running away and robbing a bank or anything is pretty interesting. There's Far Cry 2 was an incredible game that pretty much did the same thing as GTA, but in a different environment. They took the whole of the African continent and sort of compressed
right.
it down with, procedural animals and procedural weather. So there's points in that game where you're sort of running from one place to another, and you just have to stop to look at a beautiful sunset over a particular type of landscape in one, specific to one part of the African continent. It might be like tundra, or it might be a desert in one part, or it might be a jungle or whatever, and you're watching the sun set over a beautiful, absolutely beautiful view, and there's like a animal standing there sort of herding around and things. It's just incredible. It's really incredible. So that's a good one as well. I might after this give you a list.
That would be fantastic, and I would love it if this is something I always try to get people to shoot for at conferences. If there's any way to get audio or video, even later if it's not live, that's something I would really enjoy seeing. And I know at least one other archaeologist, Andrew Reinhard, that's looking at archaeology in games, things like World of Warcraft or Fable or Elder Scrolls. That would be right up his alley as well.
Yeah, right. That's very interesting. Yeah.
Right. Well, I think that's just about all the time that we have on the show today. Josh, if people want to connect with you or see more of your work, where are the places to do that, or follow you online on social media if you have accounts?
Yeah, right. So probably the best place for the sort of research work that I do is tacticalspace.org. And that's connected to just my art profile, which is joshharle.com. Tactical Space tends to get sort of blog updates for more regular updates for things, and then the projects just go onto that as project pages. That's probably best. Yeah, I'll keep that updated. Okay. Otherwise, every so often I'll put something on YouTube or Vimeo. So if you follow on the YouTube or Vimeo channels, then there'll be fairly regular updates, sort of tech updates, things like that should be worthwhile.
Yeah, I just subscribed to your YouTube channel, and even though you were at 42, and I appreciate the Douglas Adams reference, I think we need to raise that a little bit higher, because you've got some fantastic content on there.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll be happy for that.
All right, Josh, thanks for joining me again. To our listeners, thank you for listening to this episode of the Architect Podcast. Don't forget to vote for us on iTunes and listen to us on Stitcher Radio. And please leave us reviews if you like the show, if you don't like the show. If you're an archaeologist out there, or new media artist, or anybody that has a connection to digital and archaeology, please give us a ring, drop us a line if you'd like to be on the show or suggest a topic. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again. Cheers.
That's it for another episode of the Archaeotech Podcast. Links to some of the items mentioned on the show are in the show notes for this podcast, which can be found at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archaeotech. If you like the show and want to comment, please do. You can leave comments about this or any other episode on the website or on the iTunes page for this episode. You can also email us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com or use the contact form on the podcast webpage. If you'd like us to answer a question on a future episode, email us. Use the contact form on the website or tweet your questions with the hashtag Archaeotech or tag @ArcPodNet in your tweet. Please share the link to this show wherever you saw it. If you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, you can do so on iTunes or on Stitcher Radio. You can also type the name of the podcast into your favorite podcasting app and subscribe that way. Don't forget to go over to iTunes and leave a review of the show. It helps us get noticed so more people can find our podcast and benefit from the content. Also, send us show suggestions and interview suggestions. We want this to be a resource for field technicians everywhere, and we want to know what you want to know about.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to arcpodnet.com/members for more info.